All right. Well, good afternoon and good morning for those of you who may be joining us from the West Coast here virtually. My name is Amber Maynard, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I am a Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Consultant at Corteva Agriscience, headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana. So my day job really is helping to lead the implementation of our inclusion, diversity, and equity strategy around the globe. And then specifically to our conversation this afternoon, I am the operations leader for our 8 business resource groups /ERGs here at Corteva. I'm going to ask our panelists here in a second to introduce themselves. My pronouns, as you can see here on screen, are any with respect. And the question I'm going to ask them today is where is their favorite place to vacation? My family and I are big fans of the East Coast. So hello to Wilmington. We love Newcastle, Old Newcastle specifically, and that's a regular stop for us. So Nat, can I start with you?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I am Natalie Torres. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I work for ChristianaCare, in my opinion, one of the finest health systems in the U.S., but it's also Philadelphia region's most dynamic health system. By day, I get the privilege to serve this organization as the Director for Inclusion and Diversity. And my specific connection to employee resource groups I was able to work with great folks to build governance and to, there was a program in place, but we grew it by way of governance and really, I'm not going to say mastered, but really had some great learnings along the way to grow ERG programs to truly impact an organization. So my favorite place to vacation is wherever there's whales. I've got this thing, it's my jam. I don't know what it is about whales. I experienced some whales in Hawaii. I got to get to Alaska, but I just found out as a New York City native, the Princess, which is a cruise line on the Hudson River, now is experiencing some whale sightings. So wow. I guess I got to go back home to check out the whales.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. Lorie.
Thank you so much for having us. My name is Lorie Coker, and I am the Business Resource Group Program Manager at Capital One. And so really that role focuses on horizontal best practices across all of our 8 BRGs is what we call them. So some call them ERGs, Employee Resource Groups. At Capital One, we call them Business Resource Groups. My first connection to business resource groups in this case was side of desk, as we call it at Capital One. So I was a volunteer. I'm really interested in diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Prior to this role, I was doing community impact work, and I wanted to get more involved with our BRGs for networking purposes and also for leadership opportunities that may not have come from my formal job. So I started off as a volunteer, and then there was an opening within our Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and that's my current role now, and love it. So following suit here with favorite vacation spot, it's hard to even think about a vacation since I haven't been on one in over 2 years. Many of us probably haven't with the pandemic, but I would say I don't really go back to the same place twice too often. So I like new places. So the last place I went was Ireland, and that was great just for the scenery and the food and beverage, of course. And my next stop hopefully will be, I want to go to South Africa at some point. So we'll see. Of course, there are many great places in the States, but I'll take us internationally for this conversation. So
fantastic. Thanks, Lorie. Keith.
Good afternoon. Good morning. Thanks again for having me as part of this panel. As far as pronouns, he and him. I currently work at Barclays U.S. Consumer Bank here in Wilmington, and who is one of the sponsors of this great summit. And I appreciate, that we have the ability to do that and be part of it. In terms of my day-to-day job, I'm a business manager here, and I manage all of our affiliate arrangements with our other Barclays entities in terms of services and around technologies and operations for some of our other affiliate entities within the organization. In terms of my experience and my current role here, I had the opportunity to be a chair for our DE&I Council, in which my job is really to help drive the D&I strategy here at Barclays and executed here at the U.S. Consumer Bank. We have a ton of great and creative and enthusiastic people here who really want to help build an inclusive environment for all of our employees and make this a great place to work. So I'm really fortunate to be part of such a great organization that supports that and investing that in the people that they have here. In terms of my vacation spot, any beach, any sunset is actually my favorite places to go. I go down to the local beaches here, in Delaware, as we call them, instead of the shore. But I also love to travel to different parts of the world. I've been to a lot of different places and visited plenty of beaches. So that's, I think that's kind of my go-to.
Fantastic. Thanks, Keith. Well, before we get started, I just want to let all of you know out there listening that the comment section is open. We'll be monitoring that. If there's something specific that you're interested in that we've either talked about or that you'd like for us to answer today, please feel free to put that in the comments and we'll be moderating that as well. So I want to start and ask a question for each of the three of you to answer. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of ERG/BRG. I will use the two acronyms interchangeably, just so that I don't have to repeat them both every time. But let's talk about the importance of those groups for new or rising employees, so thinking young professionals. Why is it important for associates to join at least one ERG at a company? Lorie, let's begin with you.
From my perspective, and I've joined all 8 of ours because I think it's interesting to see what people are up to and how I can contribute and how I can learn. For me, I think a couple of the biggest reasons that I would recommend joining at least one would be to support your own learning and development goals, your professional goals. This is a great opportunity to invest in yourself and have informal leadership opportunities or formal leadership opportunities within the BRG space. It really helps create visibility for you as an employee. And it's also one way to have excellent networking opportunities. And so I think as you think about your own career growth, that this is a great way to network outside of those who are directly in your line of business or with whom you work on a day-to-day basis. So great leadership development opportunity and professional development as well as networking.
Great, thanks, Lorie. Keith, what are your thoughts when you think about young, new employees, rising young career professionals? Why would you suggest that it's important for them to join at least one ERG?
I think it's really important because I think it starts with the people, right? Every organization, I think, in terms of investing in the people, and I think ERGs are, serves as a platform, for opportunities for us to, drive change by promoting equality, beyond ethnicity and gender, and also promote, intersectionality, and I think it also makes us a better and more agile, resilient company to better support our customers. So for me, it's a great opportunity to, to network, to build, some of your soft skills, your hard skills, things that you want to do in terms of, career advancement. I look at ways of, it might not be things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis in your day job, but there might be opportunities in ERGs for you to take lead in, different types of projects or run initiatives or things that get that visibility and also get the support of the people that you work with and the leadership that, that are there to support you. So those are the reasons why I think it's really important for, people who are starting their career to get involved, to be vocal and to participate, to help promote change.
Great, thanks very much. Nat, not to leave you out, why would you suggest that young professionals get involved in ERGs?
Well, I totally agree with both Lorie and Keith around professional development and information sharing. But if there are 2 other things that I would add to the great list they provided, first is really to create a sense of community, especially if you're serving an organization that's sizable. What it does, it takes this big place and creates an intimate space that can be what we like to call psychologically safe. And in those psychologically safe spaces is where people can learn how to be an ally, right? You just don't become an ally, you have to learn it and earn it. In those spaces, healing can take place. So again, joining these groups truly is a great way to become a little bit more intimate in your workspace and create that sense of community. The other thing, another reason why I would really encourage folks to get involved is if an organization is really about driving anything, let's say their business goals, or we're talking about inclusion and diversity, but business goals at large, I should say we're going to look at people who are engaged in ERGs. Mm-hmm. People who are connected to employee resource groups, they are buying into the culture. They are saying, we are here and we want to do what we can do to change the experience, to change for us as caregivers at ChristianaCare, to change the caregiver experience where it's an exceptional one, where it's a great place to work, where we get to be who we be. I know that's not proper English, but you get the sentiment. So we're looking for leaders, right? Aspiring leaders who get it. And that's where, the heartbeat is in ERGs.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lorie, you gave some good advice, so I'm going to press you a little bit here. What made you decide to get involved with BRGs, and why do you stay?
Well, I'll try to keep this short and sweet, but when I came to Capital One, I think Natalie just mentioned some great points that I overlooked, but actually are at the root of why I got involved. Capital One's a huge company, and I had come from the nonprofit space, which was 30 people or 60 people, depending on the nonprofit, and Capital One is huge. And so learning and diversity inclusion was always very important to me. So for me, I think meeting new people, connecting with people that had similar interests or backgrounds or willingness to learn, I think it's important to note that you do not have to be, at least at Capital One, you don't have to self-identify as the group to be a member. So you can be an ally and still join the BRG or ERG. So for me, it was just out of feeling comfortable in my workspace. I wanted to meet similar people. I also wanted to have leadership development opportunities that I wasn't getting in my day job. And so this was a great way for me to tap into talents that I'd like to develop, or that I have and were underutilized in my current role. And frankly, I just like to be involved in ways in which to make a company. If I work somewhere, I want to believe in what we're doing, and I believe in the D&I work that Capital One is setting forth both internally and externally out in the community. I stay because of the same reasons, essentially, that I feel like there are ways in which once you're in the space, you understand how you can help drive business outcomes and business goals, and actually make this not a check in the box, but actually part of the fabric of the company. And so when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, it's you're living this. I'm living this through my BRG experience. We bring in great speakers. We bring in great leadership programs for our associates, some of which I've participated in. I stay because of the essential reasons I joined. And now I feel like there's more. Once I'm more involved, I can help steer change that I'd like to see at our company.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Keith, when you were talking about why young people should join an ERG, you mentioned, really building skills, both critical and, some of those hard skills, soft skills. When you think about your personal experience with ERGs, what one or two things being involved with ERGs helped you get to where you are today? And what advice do you have for others when they're trying to decide whether to join?
It's a bit of a personal journey for me. I was an immigrant from Laos, and, I came to a very small community of, upper middle class, mainly made of, a certain group of people. And I wanted to share my experiences from, my family coming from, a third world country and coming to the States and making, and looking for opportunities for myself. So I wanted to share my personal experiences with others. But I also wanted to learn about their experiences too, so that I can embrace our differences. I think it's a value within myself, and I think it's a value within each one of us that wants that. And I think it's my ability to put different hats on. So my advice would be is, you know, learn, listen, embrace the differences, and then the opportunities that these ERGs and even the things that are being driven by your companies, you know, around diversity, equity, inclusion, are opportunities that they're investing in you to show your uniqueness, right? And I'm fortunate that Barclays allows these opportunities for me. And if your organization does it, you know, go join. You know, that's kind of, you know, I think both Lorie, you know, had mentioned lots of different, you know, things that gets activated when you join these ERGs or BRGs that go a long way in helping develop you both professionally and personally. So, you know, my advice is go join. You know, you have that opportunity, take it, jump on it.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. Yeah. Natalie, I know everyone has pandemic fatigue, but we're going to talk a little bit about it anyway. As you think about ERGs pre-pandemic to now, how have they changed the way that they execute on their commitments? And I know you can't speak for all of us out there, but at least in the context of what you're doing at ChristianaCare, how has that changed? And then we may ask a couple other folks to jump on as well.
Loaded question. So yeah, you know, this thing called the pandemic. I mean, if you're living on planet Earth, you're deeply impacted by it. So I share this. You know, ERGs. I think historically, when I say historically, I think ERGs have been around for about 20 years. Some organizations were a little savvy and they had them even before that. But now we're you know, it's getting a lot more traction. But I think it started out with, you know, driving business goals. We learned a little bit about, again, what I mentioned before, creating that sense of community, these face-to-face experiences. But when done well, again, it's about driving business goals. Now, what we can't ignore about a pandemic is that, it happened at the same time that a social reckoning took place. We can't ignore the two, right? And while we're home, sheltering in place, with nowhere to go but to look at our TV screens, we were all experiencing some significant trauma, right? We are now living and working and serving in a traumatized or vicarious traumatized workforce. And we've got to talk about it. Before, I would say, you know, ERGs, again, we're about creating this safe space, but I feel like now, post-pandemic, it's really about, or added to its original goals, it's about driving institutional change. Activities are great. Special programs are good. Parties are good. We need them. Fellowship is important. But where I love to dance is institutional change. And quite often, I'm going to our ERGs and our ERG leaders first to say, let's get to this table and figure this thing out. Because when Natalie leaves and when these ERG leaders leave and when these members grow into other areas, we want to make sure that that institutional change is taking place. So we must acknowledge that. Virtual experiences also wasn't bad anymore, right? I know prior to the pandemic, it was like, oh, it's just so much more meaningful and impactful when we're face to face. But again, you know, this is what we were relegated to, and we had to make it work. We found very unique ways to stay engaged and connected to our people. And I'll give you two examples that really, really helped the healing that needed to take place for us in healthcare, right? So we're dealing with a social reckoning. We're tired serving and providing quality care for sick people, and not just sick people, but the people who care for the sick people. And so we had to get really, really creative in how we engaged with our caregivers, and ERGs did that. So first we had this whole thing around courageous conversations. That's what we called it, right? Crucial conversations. That was the trend for a while. Then it evolved to courageous conversations. At ChristianaCare, we call them essential because they have to happen. So we had this piece where it felt very lecture-like to some groups, particularly some marginalized groups or underrepresented groups. So our African American research group says that was cool, but we feel like our voices weren't heard. And we're in a tremendous amount of pain. So again, that ERG was able to create that safe space to let it rip and say, this was my experience today, last week, in the car, in my community, in my schools, when I was in education, et cetera, et cetera. And people showed up, executive leadership included, said, I am here to learn. I'm here to hear. A, I'm sorry, and B, I want to learn, right? So this post-pandemic world of hybrid engagement was, it still had the ability to be very powerful. We didn't have to have a room with a highly paid facilitator. No shade to the highly paid facilitators. They're important. You need them, but you can still have these essential conversations. And the second example I would bring is, again, we're trying to figure out how to keep people energized and engaged and passionate about the work. And again, in healthcare, we are fatigued. And so our Pride ERG has a whole channel where they're talking about coping with pride. And one day, someone shared in their virtual chats, this is on a Microsoft Teams page, says, you know how I cope? I dance, right? I'm a dancer and I listen to music and it makes me feel good. And that comment evolved into a virtual dance-off that lingered for weeks until this day, where every now and then when we see each other, we're like, now that we're face to face, let me see you dance. It's a small thing, but it's a little injection of fun and fellowship and hope virtually that people need. So again, there's so many great things that came out of this post-pandemic world. We've got to get creative in how we're engaging and connecting with people, because engaged people are what retain people, right? Super important.
That's great. Thanks, Natalie. We'll follow up to that. And I know that ChristianaCare obviously has a ton of people who are in on-site roles, obviously, in the care of people. But how are you planning to navigate the post-pandemic world of hybrid work arrangements? Because I'm going to guess you're going to have a fair number of folks in the system who probably are going to prefer to stay at home and keep working.
Absolutely. And there's nothing, you need those folks too. So what we have to do, what ERGs have to do, really all organizations, you've got to get creative and be mindful of these different, we'll call them occupational groups, right? Different occupational groups and how they receive information, know how they engage. And it may be one of those things where we have to kind of make adjustments and be flexible. One example is we have a one generation ERG, and their focus is to bridge this generationally diverse workforce. So it's led by multiple generations. They had an outing, and there were some folks who worked in the evening who were really upset that they couldn't engage in the evening thing. But that ERG was very intentional in saying, this is one of many. We're coming for you during the day. So, we also work in shifts, right? There's midnight, there's overnight shifts, there's evening shifts, AM shifts, hybrid workers. How we work is different. So it's constantly being creative and really just talking to people and saying what works best for you and being committed to delivering.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. Keith or Lorie, is there anything specific to the work that you're doing when you think about the pandemic that you'd like to add on to from what Natalie said? I know that's a hot topic for everybody, so I want to make sure I give you space. So Keith, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think, we have to be creative, right? I think, we also have to be intentional in how we want to reach our audiences. So I think for us, it was a mix of, when there were still opportunities for us to connect through these virtual channels, right? And, there were still opportunities for volunteering events and things that were done, virtually and not in person. As we kind of progressed into our return to office plans, I know that we had put a lot of time and effort in thinking and being very intentional about, how we bring people back to make sure that they feel safe and they're comfortable in coming back into the office. And, as that came through, we thought about how we can bring back, the ERG, some of the live events, some of the things that we can do with instances of where we still have to be careful, where, people aren't feeling comfortable, or the different organizations that we're dealing with aren't comfortable with people doing in-person events. So, we luckily for us, we have a great group of leaders and creative thinkers on how we are able to still maintain our agenda and driving, some of the events and the things that we wanted to do to still promote our ERGs. I know that we are planning a big open house here in September coming up, where we're going to have, each of our ERGs, have a spotlighted table where we're going to be creating, activations and different types of, areas within the building to allow that, in-person interaction, but also keeping in mind that we have different locations where not everyone can be in attendance in person. So, how do we do it, through some of our virtual channels where people can attend in different locations and things like that. So, I think everybody's probably about to their breaking point in terms of, what, this pandemic has happened. Now we have to deal with it and move on. And then how do we continue to drive and push our agendas forward in making it, as a normalcy as part of life now. So
great, thank you, Lorie. As the program manager with a focus in this space, is there anything that you would add specific either to Capital One or just kind of better practice for BRGs?
Sure. Just very quickly, and I know we have other questions to go to, but I think for us, for Capital One, we have a hybrid work model. So what the company has learned is that we're going hybrid. And so what that means is our BRGs have to adapt to that. And what a hybrid means is many people's jobs are just going to be remote. And so how do we ensure that there's engagement at that level? So what we've done from a BRG perspective is ensure that through our enterprise governance model, that we have virtual leads that are working hand in hand with the national leads to help ensure that they're thinking about program and engagement opportunities at a virtual space. Similarly to Keith, we're also hosting an open house, so to speak, with all of our BRGs. And so how are we offering the similar experience to those in a virtual space? So ensuring that there's equitable opportunities for both in-person and remote workers is something that we're thinking through. And to be honest, this is a new space for all of us. And so we will be learning on the fly. So a lot of testing and learning about what works, what doesn't work. There'll be tons of surveys to say, like, how do you feel connected? What other ideas do you have? So this is a learning opportunity for us. And honestly, it's really helped us kind of think differently about chapters, because when you have speaking engagements that are all virtual that we've had for the past 2 years, or events that can be done virtually, it's how are we maximizing those awesome opportunities for everyone to take advantage of. So there's been great learning opportunities from that perspective on how we can think differently. And we hope to capitalize on those opportunities to ensure there's a great experience for in-person workers and remote workers.
Great, thank you. Lorie, I'm going to stick with you for a second. As we think about our BRG, leadership and our members, inside the company, what are some of the common misconceptions people have about ERGs?
Sure. And this may not be unique to Capital One. This might be across companies, but I think, and I mentioned this earlier, I think one of the misconceptions is that you have to identify with the group. Like I'm a part of, we have Voices, which is our business resource group for Black employees, but I'm obviously not Black. And but I am an ally. I've participated in their leadership development programs prior to this role. There's so many opportunities to learn and to contribute. And so I think that one misconception is that you have to identify with the group. And that's not the case at Capital One. Secondly, I think that this work is done by the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, or by HR, that ERGs have paid folks that are doing this work, when really at Capital One, this is all employee-led, which goes back to the professional development opportunities that this could offer you, offer an associate. So these are led and driven by volunteers, by Capital One associates, which is awesome. And then the other one I would say is that BRGs are just a bunch of events, like, fun and social and fellowship. And while that's true, we actually help drive business goals. So when we think about business goals for recruiting, how is the DIB strategy aligning with HR strategy for recruiting? to help leverage some of those for interviewing. How are we leveraging BRGs for calibrations or career fairs for college graduates? So it's not just fun and events, although that's really important. We are driving business goals in a very strategic manner, and sometimes that's overlooked. But we're trying to change that misconception very quickly.
Great, thank you. I love what you said about not having to identify with the demographic. One of the things I'm consistently educating folks here at Corteva about is that very thing. In fact, they're always completely just gobsmacked to find out that you don't have to be LGBT or T to be part of Corteva Pride. In fact, plus 80% of our membership are heterosexual allies. And I mean, just the face, just like, what, really? So it's a great learning opportunity. Natalie, to sort of piggyback on Lorie's response, building on my question to her, how can we combat some of these misconceptions in the workplace?
I think you just did it, Amber. You talked about this 80%, right? And the looks on people's face. It's the data, right? Data tells a story. We cannot manage, but we're not measuring. And I'm not just talking about the membership makeup, although that is important, right? We are carefully looking at who is engaged at, from what campuses to the type of worker. We were talking about remote workers and hybrid workers and bedside folks and everything else in between, right? We've got to look at the makeup, the membership, and get into the demographics, but also the outcomes, right? Not just with ERGs, but the organization. For us, we've learned that we are a very, very diverse organization. We look like the communities that we serve. When we look at leadership level, we say, wait a minute, while we're diverse, we've got some awesome opportunities here to build on our inclusion, right? To make sure, because we can be diverse, but if we're not seeing representation in leadership spaces, then we've got new opportunities. And sharing this data, and also I think Lorie mentioned being strategic, right? Having a strategy. If you don't have a strategic plan, we're all over the place without fiscal year priorities, because the work of inclusion is massive. We are dealing with centuries of things, of systemic issues and barriers and racism and all types of things, right? So we've got to have a strategy. These are some ways that we can do it, and also tell the story through the data. If we don't narrate it, then people are going to tell it themselves. They're going to add their own characters and their own narration, and then it may not be accurate. What I would encourage a lot of organizations to do is have a scorecard, not just for inclusion and diversity, but for the work of employee resource groups. How many policies are your ERGs looking at? And how many have we been able to change? Again, that's institutional change in policies, in governance. But you've got to tell the story, share the business cases associated with it, not just in research, right, in theories, but things that are happening within your organizations. We acquired a Hispanic practice that serves a Hispanic and Latinx community. We need to talk to our Hispanic caregivers to help us get it right. We need frontliners who speak the language, who understand the culture, and not just frontliners, everybody, clinicians, physicians, all the things is like the euphemism of the week. All the things, we've got to, lean into it and lean out and jump in. So again, to combat, your question is about combating these misconceptions. Share data, folks. Join one. If you've got concerns and you you really just don't know, do what Lorie did. Join one to learn and become a learner.
Absolutely. I, here in Corteva, we're U.S.-based agriculture, and so there's a lot of, some resistance sometimes to some of our different, underrepresented minority groups, and so I always encourage those folks who are a little uncomfortable with pick the demographic and join that BRG, and then be honest about why you did it. We welcome the opportunity to help people grow and learn in psychological safety. So I appreciate that. Keith, let's talk a little bit about young professionals. We often tell them, and I say we, for those of us of a certain age, and I am of a certain age, we often tell young professionals that it's so important for them to make time for networking, for professional development within their organization or their industry, but we really know in real life how difficult it can be to make that time. Talk a little bit about how employee resource groups can make things a little bit easier for our audience to be intentional about this important part of their careers.
I think the leadership support, I think I think a lot of the companies now are investing in the people, right? And they know that with a diversified, workforce, it's going to make us sustainable for the future. I think we all want to feel included. We crave the opportunity to realize our potential and to make a difference through our uniqueness. And I think that, these employee resource groups or BRGs, provided different varieties of opportunities for everyone to participate, regardless of, if you identify with one or the other. Things like, networking, social engagements, volunteering, so colleagues can find things that speak to them. Just like a good financial planner, you want to have diversified assets, right? For companies, it's the people, and they want them and they want us to make it a priority. So I think that that's something, in terms of make it a priority. I think that you'll be surprised, that your leadership is there to really, encourage you to participate, to make a change. So make it a priority for yourselves to join one of these groups.
Great, thank you. Lorie, I'm going to lean on your expertise in programming here for a minute. For our audience members who work within an organization and they're not necessarily sole proprietors, how important is it to align ERG programming with the broader strategy and goals of the business? And what are one or two tips that folks can take back to explore or confirm that alignment?
Sure. I think, part of the reason that we're called BRGs is because it's intentionally aligned with the business strategy. And so we also find this is a place for our influence as part of the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, where we can influence business strategy in terms of some of their goals and outcomes for recruiting and retaining and promoting diverse talent. So for me, it's imperative that there's alignment, and it goes back to what we talked about with having a strategy that's specific to the lines of business. I think ways in which this can happen looks differently across different companies. But for some examples of Capital One is if we're really focusing on recruiting and retaining and promoting diverse talent, then how are we partnering with HR recruiting? How are we ensuring that there are people from diverse backgrounds, from diverse experiences, diverse lived experiences that are part of interview panels for various candidates at all levels? So not just the entry level, but also at the VP plus level. Natalie talked about the importance of having representation across that leadership level, and it goes from the whole spectrum. So how can we leverage BRG talent? Because we have leaders many of our leaders are part of the BRG. So how can we use them to get calibrated to be part of our recruiting, our interview process? Other ways in which, so focusing on key stakeholders, like coming with a strategy about how you can help the lines of business move their goals forward, essentially is what I'm saying. We have a group called Community Impact and Engagement, which is like community affairs for many companies. How can we help them think about their using BRGs for their community? So their external approach for representation and getting out in the community. So for example, 84% of the volunteer hours at Capital One are accomplished by BRG members. And so leverage them to understand where they're passionate about volunteering and how can we help, make those connections, relationships out in the community for recruiting purposes, et cetera. So those are some, I think, partnering with key leadership holders. Usually all BRGs or ERGs have accountable executives or a business leader who's higher up in the organization that has a lot of influence. So how are we connecting with those influential leaders to understand what their goals and objectives are? And how can we have those types of conversations where we can say, have you thought about this approach? Or have you thought about this strategy? Or here's what we're focusing on in terms of outcomes. How can your business help us reach our goals? How can we help you reach your goals? So knowing who the stakeholders are that can kind of tip the scale to get the actual DIB, diversity, inclusion, belonging goals as part of the fabric of the company and not just a check in the box or a cultural month, so to speak. How do we make this part of who we are and proud of who we are every day with our diversity, inclusion, and belonging efforts?
Great, thank you. Natalie, so we have ERGs, we have programming alignment. What are we missing? Executive support, right? Talk with us a little bit about how ERGs go about securing and sustaining executive leadership buy-in.
I think it goes back to what Lorie just said, right? Because without organizational alignment, you're a special interest group. You have an affinity to a thing. And I think what's important is to define what an ERG is in your organization. Are we driving, the business, whatever those business goals are? So organizational alignment is where you get your buy-in from your executive leadership. That's where the shared outcomes live, and that alone will change the game. We've got to, make the bridge, make the connection for folks who don't buy into inclusion work for goodness sake. Bring them to the bottom line, right? If you don't want to do this for goodness sake, do it for the business sake. Mm-hmm. The other thing is going back to the sponsor for each of ERGs. So there's sponsors, which is typically the governance of most ERGs. It's a best practice that there's an executive leader. We've intentionally renamed that role as an executive advisor, because a sponsor kind of implies we're just endorsing a charter, right? Or that this exists, but an advisor guides, it mentors, it gets into the grit of the activities, and it listens to the heartbeat of the constituency of those ERGs. And like Lorie said, they can take that heartbeat and bring it to the executive level and vice versa. And as they begin to do work, they can say, oh, let's make this connection here. There's a dotted line here. We can really do some interesting things together. So it's very important to have advisors, or that advisor spirit behind the sponsor, right? So language is important. And then also that person may not necessarily have the identity of that particular group, which is okay. We had having an advisor to the LGBTQ plus community who is not a member, but says, I am here to move the work along. We have a man a person who identifies as a male, as a white male, leading our women's group or advising our women's group. So we're very intentional about lining up executive leadership with these different groups. And the other thing I would just also send out to folks is I get to chat with quite a few of our neighboring health systems and health systems all over the country. And they say, how the heck are you able to do these things? And it's your question, Amber. It's because of executive support. We've got to take heed to what our leaders are saying, right? What our mission, our vision, our values. And oftentimes there's the language that you can use to move the work along. So if we're really about the language, at ChristianaCare, we talk about speaking truth with courage and empathy, embracing diversity and showing respect to everyone. So when we talk to executive leaders, we're like, this is what the language says. And so we've got to live it out. As the head goes, so does the body. The body, the arms, the legs cannot go where the head doesn't tell it to. And the head said to me that these are our values and this is important. So again, I would encourage the people that I get to talk to is, your issue isn't the people and activating folks. You've got to go straight to executive leaders. And that's where you need to focus your efforts. Don't try to duplicate what other organizations are doing until you get that executive support. It's important. Of course, you want to have supports in place, but what I'm saying, you don't want to duplicate what someone who's, or an organization that has IND or ERGs in place for 20 plus years, because you're not ready. You got to get that executive support, and you use the company's values and mission. And here's the hard truth. That is the ideology that you go into that marital relationship with. If it does not align with you personally, or it's not being lived up, then you may need to call your attorneys and go get a divorce. I need to work for an organization that believes in equity, that is unapologetic about being inclusive and embracing differences, regardless of what those differences are.
I love that. Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate that. Keith, we've talked so far about the impact of BRGs for companies and employees inside an organization. What are some of the ways that your ERGs there at Barclays are making a difference in the communities where you operate?
I could probably go on for 30 minutes about all the different ways that we've helped our local communities, through our employee volunteerings. But just like Cap One, and I think Lorie said, a majority of our volunteer events are, as part of our citizenship program here, are the volunteer hours that we put towards the nonprofits and outreach programs. In teaching, things like life skill programs with organizations like the Food Bank of Delaware and Tech Impact. Just kind of give you a flavor of, some of the things that we do here. We sponsor a small business week annually where local minority small businesses showcase their products and services right here on site, where, our employees have that opportunity to not only engage, but also, help support some of these small businesses. We partner with Delaware State University and other local universities as part of our goal to attract and recruit diverse candidates. We've worked with some of our HR and our colleague engagement to ensure that we have diverse interview panels, and we've done things like mock interviews to kind of help young professionals to get prepared for that job opportunity that may explode into a fantastic career path for them. So I think I can go on and on and on, but I think that those are some of the highlights that we've been able to help our local community here with the support, not only with our organization, but the people that work here, the people that are doing the volunteer work outside of their work hours, to make that community, as part of theirs.
Thanks, Keith. Lorie, how about at Capital One? What are some of you touched a little bit on some of the external impact, but would love to hear about maybe some of the specificity of what's going on in your communities.
Sure. And I think this is an opportunity to talk about the importance of intersectionality and how our work leverages other lines of businesses. So while we do volunteer out in the community, we have a whole team that's dedicated to that's their full-time job, as I mentioned, community impact and investment. So we actually partner with them regularly on different opportunities that might align with grant making or volunteer engagement that align with our BRGs. Additionally, I think another example of the intersectionality of how you partner with lines of business would be our recruiting. So we talk about how we can leverage our BRGs to support HBCU, historically Black college and university recruiting, and other perhaps minority groups that may not get the traditional look that they deserve. And so how are we leveraging BRGs to help get out into our communities in those ways to align with lines of business strategies? Additionally, we do work with our community impact and investment team to provide each BRG provides a small grant to an organization of their choice in partnership with community impact and investment. And I think what's interesting to note is that while that's an external partnership, we also want to ensure that we're leveraging nonprofit resources or other 501c3s that have skills and expertise that we don't have as a company to come in as external speakers, trainers, facilitators to help educate our leadership and our BRGs. So it's not that we as a big company know all, because we partner often with nonprofits to help educate us on certain topics and things of that nature. So aside from the volunteer hours, thinking about recruiting diverse talent at the internship level or college level, we're strategic about getting out in the community because we believe in recruiting diverse talent to help live out our vision and goals and mission for Capital One.
Great, thank you. Natalie, tell us a little bit about some of the great work that ChristianaCare is doing out in the community.
We have this one, we call them our work cousins, right? So I'm caregiver facing, I live in HR, but we've got this other arm. They're so dynamic, so robust and incredible folks with provocative programming, really that's outward facing and helping folks. Health disparities are a real thing and they are in the trenches. So we often, like to align and share some of the things that they're doing with our ERGs because ERGs communicate exceptionally well. We've learned that there's so many ways that people get information within an organization, and even outside, but there's something about a trusted space with the ERGs. But lots of service projects. I did share earlier about the Hispanic and Latinx practice that we've acquired to get that right. That's going to be one of many in the upcoming years. We've integrated ERGs into behavior interviews. And that is an indirect impact that's outward facing because we've got a whole different perspective or insight or vantage point in the interviewing space. And when we're attracting diverse talent, that absolutely impacts health outcomes. URMs, those are underrepresented minorities in medicine, and persons of color in leadership is really kind of it is the heartbeat of our current strategy, right? We're in a 3-year strategy, and we're looking to attract not just attract, but also retain URMs, because we know that if we have physicians and clinicians or administrators or an office personnel or whatever in place to provide care for a particular demographic and community, we're going to get it right. The health outcome is going to be different. I'll share something recently. We have a one of our leaders in the medical group. I'm going to give him a shout out. I don't know if he'll get it. Dr. Kirk Garrett. He leads our cardio and heart and vascular building, and he was sharing in a presentation all the cool new things he's doing in that space, but he ended it with the diversity within his team. And so I said, Dr. Garrett, I raised my little virtual hand, and I said, Dr. Garrett, please tell me, how did you accomplish attracting, retaining, hiring, all the things? How did you do that with URMs and get persons of color in leadership? Because the truth is, medical schools are not producing persons of color. It's a marginal group of folks that people like me are competing for across the nation. He says something that changed me, and I hope it'll change you and anybody else who's working in inclusion work. He says, I stopped looking at traditional tools to measure success. Instead, I thought about how they can contribute. How can they advance my patient, right? And more importantly, their health outcomes, it became personal. And so if he's a leader, and leaders aren't, their report card isn't them, the report card is their people. In his case, it's his patients, right? So that is something that, we've got a bunch of Kirk Garretts throughout our system. They're really changing the community. And there's some other things that I know these the organizations that are represented on this panel, you all are involved in Black Achievers, so are we. Just this year, ChristianaCare gave $500,000 to graduating high school students who are pursuing medical degrees or healthcare degree programs and attending HBCUs. And those are just a few things, but there's so much going on. But I do think where we all fail is we're not sharing our story. We're not narrating, we're not telling it. So we're doing our best, but I know a lot of the organizations here are doing exceptional work. So shout out to you all, virtual high fives. But it's so much more than inward facing. We've got to make sure that we're investing in our community, be it in resources and dollars or with our time and in our experts.
Thanks, Natalie. My favorite mantra is really that change happens one conversation at a time. And it really is about sharing the narrative, telling the stories, because people will remember that. We can share yes, the data has to drive the work, but at the end of the day, it's the stories that really connect the data, to the real world scenarios. Natalie, when we think about some of our audience members who may be part of smaller organizations or maybe even large organizations who haven't brought ERGs on board, or maybe are sole proprietors right now, but at some point may grow their businesses, that they don't have or haven't been able to tap into the magic of ERGs. For companies that don't have this program, or for business owners who maybe want to make sure they have some component of this in the future as their business grows, how do you recommend someone get started?
Yeah, this is your learning season, right? You got to learn the rules of a game before you start to play it. So spend time learning, but also developing your governance. I've seen this quite often. ERGs are formed, but there's no governance in place. And then what that ends up becoming are special interest groups. Here's a good example. I was working with another organization, and they did not define what an ERG is because there was no governance in place. And they had an ERG for Wiccans, right? Or witches. It did not drive organizational goals. So I would pause and take the time to define what it is within your organizations. I think there was another group that came to our office that said, we'd like to start a botany ERG and a pet ERG. Think it's great thing to be, but that's an interest group. That's a special interest group, maybe an affinity group, but it's not an employee resource group. So spend the time developing your governance, but also defining it. And there's so many blueprints out there. Align yourself with an organization that has a thriving ERG program. Last year, ChristianaCare received a really awesome award as one of the best ERG programs in the nation from Diversity Impact. And it was because of our governance, but also how we were able to, because we're sizable and some folks are global, we had to automate things because it's volunteers driving the work. So we've got to make it easy for them, again, to help advance IND. But again, if there's one thing, and I'll surmise it as this, that you can do, spend the time to develop your governance before you open the doors to an ERG program.
That's great. Thanks, Natalie. Keith, any additional thoughts on how to go about getting those off the ground?
Well, I mean, I think Natalie and Lorie and yourself are great starting points. I think Natalie hit it on the nose there in terms of the research, right? Finding those organizations that have been successful and getting those blueprints, right? In terms of them embedding it into their culture, ones that have invested into the people that you can leverage. But I do feel that governance around that is really important because the governance is what helps drives us to those business goals and achieving those business goals. So I can relate to what Natalie said, in terms of having that governance, right? Doing that research, really kind of just learning and making sure that, what we're trying to drive is put it into a plan that's going to be successful. The other recommendation I would do is assess your current organization, right? And see what it is where your organization is in this life cycle of what you're trying to get to, and how then you can push those boundaries around the agenda, right, that you're driving through that governance process that you are researching. And most importantly, I think we talked a lot about this, is getting the support from your leadership, right? Leadership, right? Good leadership will get behind you, right? And I think at the end of the day, when we talk about, sponsorships or advisors, things like that, these accountable executives that will help you drive those agendas. So definitely get your leadership behind what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Great. Thanks, Keith. And Lorie, what would be your thoughts around, for companies who don't have this structure yet, or for, like I said, for business owners who may be thinking about growing business, or maybe are at a point where they can maybe layer some of this on? What are your thoughts about getting started?
Sure. And I'll speak like an auctioneer here because I know we're almost at time. So in sum, I think that everybody's kind of commented on what I would say. As a small company or someone who doesn't have it, or someone who's interested in potentially starting this, I would actually take time to interview your team, your associates, to see what their interests are and give them some examples. There are plenty of examples out there, as Natalie mentioned. You go to Google and just Google best practices for BRGs, or blueprints for BRGs, or governance structures. There are organizations like Saramount, Diversity Inc., Gartner. Those are all organizations that really help support ERG work. You can leverage those as experts in the field and consult with them to get some expertise. But I would take time to understand the why. Why do you want this? What are the common BRGs, and how might they align with some of your strategies and goals? And then the final thing I'd say is, or maybe not the final, is start small. Don't try to take on 5 at one time. I would start. We're adding 1 for the first time in 10 years. So take time to make sure that it makes sense and that there can be sustainability. And finally, I think, as Keith mentioned, I would just ensure that there's leadership support. Because ultimately you need a little bit of funding. You need to make sure it's sustainable, and that happens usually at the top with a great business case that you can present from available free resources online, or working with partners that focus on this area of expertise.
Great. Thanks, Lorie. I'm going to take a quick look at the comments before we move to our final question. There's been some, people have made a comment that, some of the things that each one of you have said have resonated with folks, and they've echoed those. We have an attendee who says that their company actually grants employees 40 hours to use for community volunteering as something that matters to them. I think a lot of our companies have some component of that, that it is a great way to get more people to join ERG volunteer events as well as their own. And so for those of you out there who are in a position to maybe influence that at your company, would strongly recommend that. We're blessed at Corteva to have a little bit of time as well that we can devote to our, to those things that matter to us. And then for those of you who maybe have final questions, Julie Powers was who mentioned that 40 hours, and she just said, shout out to MNT Bank. So Julie, thanks for sharing that with us. I think that's a great thing for companies to think about if they're not already doing some component of that. So I'm getting ready to ask the final question of our panelists. So if there's anyone who has a question that they'd like to pose to any of our panelists, please put that in the comments. I'll keep an eye on that as our final question makes its way around. And so we'll start with Keith. This is the final question, and each one of you are going to be on the hook to answer this. So if there is only one thing that you hope our audience takes away as a result of our conversation today, what would it be? And Keith, I'm going to begin with you.
Just one.
Just the one.
I would say be courageous, and I think everything else after that will come, Be courageous, speak up, listen, and be a leader in your community and your organization to create solution with diverse voices. That's the one thing that I would say. I would hope that everyone that's on here in the audience takes away from what I've been able to provide in terms of my experience. So.
Thanks, Keith. I love the courageous piece. One of my favorite quotes is Tina Fey, and she says, say yes, you'll figure it out afterwards. So I love the leading with some courageous behavior there. Lorie, how about you? What's the one thing that you hope people take away?
I would say start with step one, and that's join them. Join the BRGs. All these things that we talked about in terms of leadership, governance structure, and making change for your company, and all these things that we've talked about today can only happen when you actually join the BRGs. And all you do is sign up. You're going to get newsletters. You're going to get updates. You might have a Slack channel. You can participate as much as you like or as little as you like. The idea is that you learn where you fit in. And you get in where you fit in, and then you take it to the next level based on your passion and your interest. So the number one advice is, it's pretty cliche, but just join.
Now that's fair. I mean, that's the first step, right? I'm always talking to our BRG leaders around the world saying, meet people where they are, seek to understand, and then respectfully challenge them to take that next step forward. So I think that's great advice, Lorie. Just get out there and join. And Natalie, last but not least, how about you? What's the one thing?
So I rock hard for ERGs because they are powerful. If ran well, they can be incredibly powerful in influencing and changing a culture. We have strategies. Every organization has them. Sometimes we even pay, again, those facilitators to create them and have our external affairs teams to make them pretty, and they're important. But if we don't take heed to the culture, that culture is going to eat that strategy for breakfast every single time. ERGs is where we can really drive and change the culture of an organization.
That's perfect. Thank you. And then my one thing is be intentional. For those of you who are young professionals out there, I know that you're grinding and you're trying to make your way up the ladder. If you don't make it intentional, when you put an ERG event on your calendar, treat it as sacred. Whatever's sacred to you. If gym time is sacred to you, if talking to a parent on the phone, whatever that thing is that you never miss, make this that thing as well. And put it when, to Lorie's point, when the newsletter comes out and you say, oh, I think I'd like to, to attend that event, get it on your calendar. And then, there are so few things in our world outside the healthcare space where we do have both critical and urgent at the same time. Most of us are in roles that there are critical things and there are urgent things, but very rarely are there things that are critical and urgent. So put it on your calendar, keep it sacred unless that thing is critical and urgent to interrupt it. So I want to say thank you to my esteemed panelists here. It's just been great working together. I will go ahead and say to all of you out there in the audience, we're all on LinkedIn, so please find us out there. So apologies, Lorie, Natalie, and Keith, if your inboxes on LinkedIn blow up for me just putting that out there. But for all of us, we're here to help you all grow as young professionals, and just really appreciate the opportunity and the time that you've given to make this space sacred to join us. So I don't have any questions and comments, and I've never met a group of people who are not happy to have a few extra minutes in transition to the next place. So Charlie, with that, I think we can adjourn the panel.